Yeah, one of the questions that came in was asking why this person felt that the panel was one-sided, and they were frustrated that you did not include a Democratic point of view, so someone who openly identified as a Democratic person or voter. And another question that came in as related asked why you didn't put forth Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as a viable third option in this presidential election. And I think those are kind of related. Why didn't you have anybody who said they were a Democrat on the panel? And what about RFK?
Well, let me take that in reverse order. We did talk about third-party voting, which I think is where a lot of folks are who feel that both candidates are morally compromised, at least at the top of the ticket. Of course, one of the big headlines of what we've been saying over and over and over, using this framework of lessening evil and trying to put a little skin on what that maybe looks like, is how important it is down ballot, how important it is at the state level. And once you start talking about that, you're no longer talking about three parties in most races. You're not talking about that when it comes to, voting to retain judges, or you're not talking about that when you're talking about the ballot initiatives. You're not even talking about that when you're talking about a lot of school board races or local races, because there's not third parties represented. And so when we were talking about that, we weren't talking about any candidates whatsoever. So to mention Robert F. Kennedy by name is just not something we would say, or for that matter, Cornel West.
Is he running?
He is. You didn't know that?
All right. No, I did not.
And there you go. I mean, and of course, that's the other answer is that at least where we're at now, there's no such thing as a viable third party candidate. There is such a thing as a third party spoiler, which of course Ross Perot played, as many analysts will look at, years ago. And it seems that the third party support for RFK seems to be dropping. And now we're just talking about poll numbers. But he had kind of garnered a pretty high level for third parties, or as third parties go, given the very low popularity ratings of the two candidates when it was President Biden and former President Trump at the top of the ticket. So some of those realities are changing on the ground all the time, but it wasn't an intentional omission. It was just, we were talking about these things in principle, which we tend to do. As far as the quote unquote balance, I thought, and maybe the question came in a little bit before we addressed an aspect of this. Maybe that's really clear. I asked Eric Tietzel, for example, are the two parties equal? Now he had offered a framework, and I meant morally so, but he had offered a framework that I thought was pretty helpful, or at least some realities on the ground that you have to consider. That on each side, when you're looking at a candidate, you got three features. Number one is the philosophy of the movement that they represent. So you have a conservative movement and a progressive movement. You have the party alignment with that movement, and then you have the candidate alignment with the party and with the movement. And those things could be in a straight line, or they could all be, crooked. We have talked very, very plainly about the misalignment of the conservative movement and the GOP party platform right now, given the pretty significant changes on the issues of life and family. There is more alignment, I think, between the progressive vision or the progressive philosophy and the Democratic platform as it's moved more on at least those two issues. And those aren't the only two issues, but more on that here in a second. Eric Tietzel, our guest, said something really clear, is that no, the progressive philosophy is not in alignment with a Christian worldview. We were wrestling with a Christian worldview of voting. We dealt with the left, not as in terms of candidates. We talked about that actually on Breakpoint just today, a commentary dealing with some comments made by Pete Buttigieg, which is a really hard thing to say. That name when you're doing it in a hurry. Listeners will know that was my fourth take on that name.
You missed something really spectacular.
You missed some fun stuff there, but we're hopefully they got edited or Carlos is fired. Pete Buttigieg, where he basically said abortion is a means of male freedom.
He's not wrong. He's not wrong.
No, he's actually absolutely right, and it's a horrific way of thinking about sexuality and thinking about women's dignity and the rights and well-being of children, and completely misses the things that are to be conserved in order to have a strong foundation for a healthy and flourishing society. So that's the philosophical distance between a Christian worldview and that progressive philosophy. Inasmuch a candidate does or does not embrace that philosophy is how we have to evaluate the candidates. And then everything that the candidate represents. So no, we won't have, at this point, because of the alignment of the progressive vision of reality and the party platform, a spokesperson for that is not in the realm of a Christian worldview. Now, the response, and we got this response, is what about on, issues of immigration? What about on issues of, caring for the poor? What about on issues of, and then you fill in the blank. And I answer that. Number one is I think that's a talking point. Yes, Jesus talked about all of that. He did not give all of that to the purview of the state. The state's actually not good at compassion. That's not the state's job. When others do not step into the compassion gap, that's when the state has to. And we are now at a point in human history where we don't argue about whether to help the poor. We argue about how to help the poor. And the critiques of those who want non-state actors to help the poor is that the state's not good at it. And the critique of those on the left, including major, kind of media publications and so on, is that if you do not think it's the state's job, then you do not think the poor should be helped. I don't accept that analysis. Now, we could say that we're not doing it well. We could say that people are falling through the gaps. We could say that the church or other players, non-state actors, need to do better. I will say all of those things. I will also say, as I did the other night, and we talked a little bit about this, is that there's a hierarchy of issues. I'm convinced of this. There are, and this is why we've been so critical of the GOP platform shift. And we've got people writing us, calling us naive. Of course, in this job, one of my favorite parts are all the people who tell me what Chuck would have said and Chuck Colson would have done. I knew Chuck, is the email that I get. And I appreciate that. A lot of people feel like they really knew Chuck, and I do as well. And none of us knew him as well as probably we think we did. And I'm because we really disagree on, whether he would have completely, whether he would have been silent on this. I am absolutely convinced Chuck would have been as alarmed as I am, maybe more, seeing this shift in the GOP platform away from the two things he believed were fundamental issues that needed to be conserved. He had three. He wrote about them. It was called the Manhattan Declaration. We did have this conversation that life, marriage, and religious and conscience rights are things that you can't compromise. If you don't get those right, you don't get things downstream right. That's what he believed. We did have this conversation in 2007. I remember this conversation very, very clear about whether when you vote, there's a hierarchy of issues that you should consider, or you should just line them all up and then, say, this party's 2 out of 10, that party's 8 out of 10. He believed that life, marriage, and conscience rights were fundamental. That was the content and the substance of the Manhattan Declaration. And so for a conservative party to move away from two of those things, at least, it would, I think, would have been alarming, for him. And that's the way we have to add. That's the way we have to walk into this. That's the way we have to be informed. I will say, and I've become more convinced. I was on a podcast this week, Maria, with Abdu Murray, and we were having this conversation. I don't know when it'll air. It'll probably be down the road. But, he said something really interesting about this approach that we're trying to flesh out about the lesser of two evils versus lessening evil. And he said, it seems like lessening evil actually leaves you something positive you can do, because it's a good thing when you can lessen evil. And I said, well, I appreciate that. I think that's true. As opposed to being a victim of whoever is at the top of the ticket. But I also think that this approach requires being a more informed voter than just listening to the talking points from whichever media echo chamber you're in. You got to do a little bit more work than that. And I think that's a good call for Christians who do not think that everything is going to be accomplished in November, because it will not. who do not place the fate of society in the hands of whoever gets in office, because that's not where it rests, although it matters greatly. And so being able to kind of walk and chew gum in that sense, I think, is maybe what's helpful.